Tonight, I want you to imagine a small town where nothing ever seems to change, and yet, something always quietly does. There's a street there, at the very edge of town, where a single porch light has been left on for years. No one remembers exactly why, but no one has ever turned it off. There are certain nights in a place like Milford Junction, when the world seems to slow itself down without asking anyone's permission, as if the day has quietly decided it has done enough, and the night is allowed to arrive gently, without urgency, without noise, without anything that might disturb the steady rhythm of things. And if you were to step outside on one of those nights, not in any hurry, not with anywhere important to be, just stepping out because the air feels a little softer than usual, you might notice how everything seems to settle into itself. The houses growing quieter, the sidewalks holding on to the last warmth of the day, and the trees shifting just enough in the breeze to remind you that something is still moving, even when it feels like nothing is now. Maple Street is not the busiest part of Milford Junction, and it has never tried to be. It sits just far enough away from Main Street that the sounds of the town arrive softened, like they have traveled a long way and lost their sharp edges along the way. And the houses there are the kind that have seen many seasons come and go without feeling the need to change too much. Porches slightly worn, paint a little faded, but everything still standing just as it should on most evenings. If you were to walk down Maple Street around the time supper dishes are being put away and the last of the daylight is slipping behind the rooftops, you would find a familiar pattern settling in, a rhythm that does not need to be announced because everyone already knows it. The porch lights coming on one by one, not all at once, but in a slow and thoughtful way, as if each house is deciding for itself. When it is ready to turn toward the night, some lights glow warm and steady. Others flicker once before settling, and a few stay dark entirely, depending on who is home and who prefers the quiet of the dark. And all of it together creates a kind of map. Not the kind you would find on paper, but one you feel more than you see. A gentle outline of a town preparing to restand in a place like Milford Junction. People notice these things, not in a way that feels intrusive, but in the quiet, passing way that comes from living somewhere long enough to understand its habits. The way Mrs. Dorsey notices when the bakery light turns off earlier than usual, or how Mr. Leland can tell if rain is coming just by the way the wind moves past the hardware store window. It is not curiosity in the noisy sense. It is something softer than that, something closer to familiarity, and that is why, on this particular evening, something as small as a single porch light staying on just a little longer than expected was enough to shift the shape of the night. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make anyone stop what they were doing, but just enough to be noticed. The house at the end of Maple Street belonged to Mr. Ellison, and if you had lived in Milford Junction for any amount of time, you would know him in the same quiet way. You know the sound of the train in the distance or the smell of lilacs in the spring. Always there, always consistent, never asking for attention, Mr. Ellison was not a man who spoke more than necessary. He nodded when greeting someone, sometimes raised a hand if he was feeling particularly conversational, and that was usually the extent of it. And yet there was something about him that made him a steady part of the town, like a piece of furniture that had always been there and would feel strange if it were gone. His routines were known, Not because he told anyone, but because he followed them so carefully that they became part of the town's own rhythm. The way he swept his porch in the late afternoon, the way he collected his mail at nearly the same time each day, and most notably, the way his porch light turned off each night just before 9, not a minute later, not a minute earlier, and over time. Without anyone really deciding to, that small habit became something people expected, something that fit neatly into the quiet understanding of how things worked on Maple Street. So, when the light stayed on, it did not go unnoticed, Mrs. Dorsey was the first to see it, though she would not have said so outright. She was standing in her kitchen, drying a plate slowly, more out of habit than necessity, when her eyes drifted toward the window, as they often did in the evenings when there was nothing particular to watch. Just the comfort of seeing the street settle into its night. She paused not for long, just enough to notice. Light at the end of the street. Still on, she leaned a little closer to the glass, not with concern, but with that quiet attentiveness that comes from noticing something that does not quite match what you expect. "H.M.," she said softly, though there was no one in the room to hear it, and that was all. She did not step outside. She did not call anyone. She simply set the plate down, folded the towel over the edge of the sink, and continued on with her evening, because in Milford Junction, not every small change requires an answer right away across the street. Mr. Leland was sitting in his chair near the window, the radio humming quietly beside him, tuned low enough that the voices blended into a kind of background murmur. And though he was not looking directly at Maple Street, he noticed the light too, not with his eyes at first, but with that subtle awareness that comes from years of sitting in the same place, watching the same patterns unfold. He glanced up just once, then nodded to himself in a way that suggested he had seen something. Though he did not yet have a reason to think much of it, the night continued as it always did, the air cooling gently, the sounds of the day fading into softer tones. A distant car passing now and then, the faint rustle of leaves shifting in the breeze, and somewhere far off, the quiet call of a train making its way through the edge of town. And still, the light remained not bright, not demanding attention, just steady, just present, as if it had decided, for reasons of its own, that it was not quite ready to turn off. And that was how it began, not with a question, not with concern, but with a small noticing, kind that settles quietly into a place like Milford Junction and waits, not for answers, but simply to be part of the story that unfolds at its own pace. Now, in a place like Milford Junction, a person does not need to say very much to be known. In fact, most people are understood not by what they tell you, but by the small patterns they leave behind, the kind that settle into the day so gently that you stop noticing them until something shifts. And Mr. Ellison was exactly that kind of man. If you asked anyone about him, you would not get a long story, not the kind filled with dramatic turns or remarkable events, but rather a collection of small observations offered slowly, as if each one had to be considered before being spoken. Someone might say he always wore the same kind of jacket, no matter the season, a brown one with pockets that seemed to hold more than they should, though no one could say exactly what was in them. Another might mention that he preferred to shop early, arriving at the grocery store just after it opened, moving through the aisles with a quiet efficiency, picking only what he needed, never lingering long enough to become part of a conversation. And then there were those who would point out that he had a way of listening, really listening when someone spoke to him, not interrupting, not adding much, just nodding slightly as if storing the words away somewhere for later. Though whether he ever returned to them was something no one knew, but more than anything else, people remembered his routines, because routines in a town like Milford Junction are a kind of language all their own. Each morning, just after the sun had begun to settle into the sky, but before the town was fully awake, Mr. Ellison would step out onto his porch, not in a hurry, not with any sense of urgency, but with the steady movement of someone who had done the same thing so many times, it no longer required thought. He would stand there for a moment looking out over Maple Street, not searching for anything, just observing, and then, after that quiet pause, he would take up his broom, the same old wooden-handled one that leaned against the railing, and begin to sweep the porch in slow, careful strokes, not missing a corner, not rushing the motion, as if the act itself mattered more than the result. The sound of the broom was soft, a gentle brushing against the wood, just enough to mark the beginning of the day for those who happened to be awake early enough to hear it after that. He would collect his mail, even on days when there was none, opening the box, glancing inside, and closing it again with the same measured movement, as if the absence of letters was just as much a part of the routine as their presence by mid-morning. He was usually gone from the house, though no one paid much attention to where he went, because in Milford Junction, people trusted that others had their reasons. Even if those reasons remained unspoken sometimes, he could be seen at the hardware store, standing near the back where the shelves were lined with things that had not changed in years. Nails, hinges, tools that looked older than the building itself. And Mr. Leland would nod to him from behind the counter, not asking what he needed, because most of the time, Mr. Ellison did not come in to buy anything. He would just stand there for a while looking, thinking. Perhaps, or maybe, just passing the time in a place that felt familiar. And then, just as quietly as he arrived, he would leave. In the afternoons, he often walked, not far, not with any particular destination, just along Maple Street and back again, his steps steady, his gaze calm, occasionally pausing to look at something others might pass without noticing, a tree, a patch of grass. The way the light settled on the sidewalk, and in the evenings, everything slowed. Even further, supper was simple. Though no one knew exactly what he cooked, there were no strong smells drifting from his kitchen, no clatter of dishes that reached the street, just a quiet settling, as if the house itself was taking part in the same routine. The windows would glow softly for a while, then dim, and then, at nearly the same moment each night, the porch light would turn off. It was such a small thing, so ordinary, and yet it had become something people expected without ever realizing they did. A signal, perhaps, that the day was finished, that things were as they should be, that Milford Junction had slipped gently into night. And that is why, when the light did not turn off, it stayed with people, even if they did not speak of it directly, because when something so steady shifts, even slightly, it leaves a space behind, not an empty one, but a noticeable one. That evening, as the light continued to glow at the end of Maple Street, a few more people became aware of it, not all at once, not in a way that gathered attention, but in the same quiet, drifting manner that all things in Milford Junction seemed to move Mrs. Carty noticed it as she pulled her curtains closed, pausing just long enough to glance down the street, her hands still resting on the fabric, her expression thoughtful. Though not concerned, young Tommy Wilkes saw it while riding his bicycle home, slowing just slightly as he passed the house, not because he thought anything was wrong, but because something felt different in a way he could not quite explain, even the mail carrier. Calvin, who had finished his rours earlier, found himself thinking about it as he sat at his kitchen table, though he could not have said why. Only that something about the day had felt just a little out of place, and through it all, the light remained steady, unchanging, as if it belonged to a different rhythm altogether now. In some places, a thing like that might lead to questions, to knocking on doors, to voices raised in curiosity or concern. But Milford Junction was not that kind of place here. Things were given time to settle, time to reveal themselves in their own way. And so the night moved forward, slowly, gently, the air cooling, the sounds fading, the town drifting towards sleep, and still, at the very end of Maple Street, porch light stayed on, not demanding attention, not offering explanation, just present, waiting, perhaps, or maybe simply continuing in the quiet way that some things do. In Milford Junction, most days do not arrive with any kind of announcement. They simply unfold, one small moment at a time, like the slow opening of a curtain that no one is really watching. And yet everyone somehow feels, and if you were to look closely at a day in late spring, you might notice how it builds itself quietly, beginning with the soft light that slips in through kitchen windows, touching the edges of tables and chairs, settling into corners where the night had lingered just a little longer than expected. That was the kind of morning that followed the night, when the porch light stayed on nothing unusual at first glance, nothing that would make a person stop in their tracks. And yet, if you paid attention, there was a slight difference in the way the day moved, as if something small had shifted, not enough to change anything outright, but enough to be felt beneath the surface. The sun came up as it always did, slow and steady, rising behind the water tower and casting a pale gold light across Maple Street, and the air carried that familiar scent of damp earth and lilac, the kind that lingers in the early hours before the warmth of the day begins to take hold. Mrs. Dorsey was up early, as she often was, standing at her stove with the kettle warming gently, her movements unhurried, her thoughts drifting in that quiet space between waking and the start of the day. She did not go straight to the window, not right away, but eventually. As she reached for her cup, her eyes moved in that direction, almost without thinking, and there it was, the house at the end of the street, the porch light still on. She paused, just for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter, her expression thoughtful, though not troubled. "Well," she said softly, as if answering a question no one had asked, and then she turned back to her tea, because in Milford Junction, even when something is noticed, it is not always followed. Sometimes it is simply allowed to exist out on Maple Street. The morning began to gather itself, the quiet broken gently by the familiar sounds of the town waking up, a car door closing somewhere down the block, the soft hum of a lawnmower starting up earlier than necessary, and the distant call of a train making its slow way past the edge of town. The robins were busy in the grass, moving with that steady patience they seemed to carry every spring, pausing, listening, and then pulling something unseen from the earth, their rhythm uninterrupted by anything around them. And through it all, the porch light remained unchanged by mid-morning. People had begun to move through their routines, stepping out onto porches, walking to their cars, exchanging small nods and quiet greetings that carried just enough warmth to acknowledge one another without asking for more. Mr. Leland unlocked the hardware store at precisely the same time he always did, the bell above the door giving its usual soft jangle as he stepped inside. And though he moved through his tasks with the same care as always, there was a moment, brief and easy to miss, when he paused near the window just long enough to look down Maple Street, to notice, and then continue at the grocery store. The morning crowd was light, a few early shoppers moving slowly through the aisles, their carts only half full, their conversations drifting between small observations about the weather and the price of things. That had not changed much in years, mister. Ellison was not among them, not that morning, and while that, too, might not have seemed unusual on its own, it added quietly to the shape of the day. Another small detail that did not quite settle where it should, because M.R. Ellison, as people understood him, was a man of patterns, and when patterns shift even slightly, they leave behind something that can be felt. Even if it is not named around noon, the sunlight grew stronger, settling more firmly on the sidewalks and drawing out the soft scent of grass and wormwood, and the town moved into that familiar midday lull, the kind that slows conversation and stretches time just enough to make everything feel a little. Softer children passed through on their way home from school, their voices rising and falling in easy bursts of laughter, their footsteps quick but unhurried, as if the day still belonged to them, one of them. A small boy with a red cap pulled low over his eyes glanced toward the end of Maple Street as he walked, his gaze lingering for a moment on the house with the light. He did not say anything, just looked, and then kept walking as children often do, noticing more than they explained. The afternoon drifted on the kind of slow unfolding that did not ask for attention, kind that simply existed, and somewhere in the middle of it all, as the sun began its quiet descent and the shadows stretched a little longer across the lawns, there came a moment, small, almost unnoticeable, when someone realized they had not seen Mr. Ellison all day, not in the morning, not at the store, not walking along Maple Street, not anywhere. It was not said out loud, not at first, because in Milford Junction, absence is not immediately questioned, is given space the same way everything else is. Asterisk, but it lingered in the back of thoughts, in the quiet pauses between conversations, in the way people glanced, just briefly, toward the end of the street, and as evening approached, the town once again began its gentle transition into night, the same familiar rhythm returning, porch lights flickering on one by one, windows glowing softly, the air cooling just enough to carry the scent of lilacs a little farther than before, and then as the sky deepened and the last of the daylight slipped away, there was that moment again, the one people did not speak about, but all seemed to notice: the porch light still on, just as it had been the night before, steady, unchanging, and now perhaps a little more noticeable. than it had been before, not because it was brighter, not because it had changed, but because something else had something. Small something, quiet something that had yet to be. Understood, and so the night settled in once more over Milford Junction. Soft and unhurried, the sounds fading, the lights dimming, the town easing into its familiar rest all, except for one, at the very end of Maple Street, where the porch light continued to glow as if keeping its own time separate under quietly waiting. In a town like Milford Junction, people do not usually go looking for answers right away. They let things settle first, the way dust settles after a quiet afternoon, or the way the air cools slowly once the sun begins to slip behind the trees, and most of the time that is enough. But every now and then, small thing lingers just a little longer than expected. When it does, someone, without quite deciding to, takes a step closer that evening. As the light at the end of Maple Street continued to glow in that same steady, unchanging way, Mrs. Dorsey found herself standing by her front door a little longer than usual, her hand resting lightly against the frame, her gaze drifting down the street. She had finished her dishes, folded her towel, set everything in its place, just as she always did. Yet something remained, not worry, not urgency, just a quiet pull, the kind that does not ask, but simply waits. Outside, the air had taken on that soft evening coolness, the kind that makes you pause before stepping out, as if deciding whether you need a sweater or not, and the street itself was settling into its nighttime rhythm, porch lights glowing, windows dimming, the faint sound of a radio drifting from somewhere nearby. Mrs. Dorsey stepped onto her porch slowly, not with purpose exactly, but not without it either. She looked down Maple Street toward the house, toward the light, still on, still steady, and after a moment she began to walk now. It was not a long distance. Maple Street does not stretch very far, and she had walked it countless times before, in all kinds of weather, in all seasons, and yet that evening, the walk felt just a little different, not unfamiliar, just quieter. Her steps were soft against the pavement, her hands folded lightly in front of her, and as she passed each house, there was that gentle awareness of being part of something shared, the quiet understanding that everyone was settling into the same evening, even if they were doing so in their own way. A curtain shifted in one window, a porch chair creaked softly as someone adjusted their seat, a dog barked once, then settled again, and through it all the light remained ahead of her, not closer yet, but waiting. She reached the middle of the street. She slowed slightly, not because she was tired, but because there was no reason to hurry, and perhaps, in some quiet way, because she was not entirely sure what she would do when she arrived in Milford Junction. You do not rush into moments. You arrive at them gently. The house came into clearer view as she walked, its shape familiar, its porch just as it had always been, the railing worn in the same places, the steps slightly curved from years of use, and the light, soft, warm moon change. She stopped a short distance away, not at the gate, not at the steps, just near enough to see, near enough to feel the quiet of the place. There was no sound from inside, no movement at the windows, no sign that anything was different beyond what could already be seen. Yet standing there was a sense of stillness that felt deeper than usual, not empty, not abandoned, just still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Dorsey tilted her head slightly, listening without expecting to hear anything. And for a moment, she thought she might turn back, leave things as they were, let the night continue without interruption, because sometimes that is the way of things. But instead she took a few more steps closer. Now to the gate her hand hovered briefly. Above it then rested gently. Against the wood it was cool to the touch, solid, familiar hand. Still she did not open it. She did not call out. She simply stood there looking, not searching, just being present in the quiet. After a while, she let her hand fall back to her side, her shoulders relaxing slightly, as if whatever had brought her there had settled, not answered, but acknowledged, and that was enough for Nausch. He turned slowly and began to walk back the way she had come, her steps just as soft, her pace just as unhurried, the street welcoming her back into its gentle rhythm without question behind her. The light remained still on, still steady, still part of the night in a way that did not demand explanation. By the time she reached her own porch, the sky had deepened into that quiet shade of blue that sits just before darkness fully takes hold, and the sounds of the town had softened even further. The distant hum of a late car, the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of wood settling as the temperature dropped. Mrs. Dorsey stepped inside, closed the door, and paused for a moment, as if considering something, then nodded slightly to herself, a small gesture almost invisible, and moved on with her evening across town. Others were doing much the same, settling in, turning off lights, pulling curtains, letting the day come to its natural close. But somewhere in the quiet spaces between those small, ordinary actions, the thought remained: the light, the house, Mr. Ellison, not in a way that pressed for answers, but in the way a small, gentle question can exist without needing to be spoken. And so the night in Milford Junction unfolded once more, soft and unhurried, the town resting, the streets quiet, the air cool and still, all except for one place at the end of Maple Street. The porch light continued to glow steady, unchanging, and quietly waiting. In Milford Junction, it is often the people who say the least who notice the most, not because they are looking for anything unusual, but because they have not yet learned to overlook the small things. Children, especially, have a way of seeing the world as it is, without fitting it into patterns too quickly, without explaining it away before it has had a chance to settle. And that is how it was with Tommy Wilkesnow. Tommy was not the kind of child who drew attention to himself. He moved through the town in that easy, unhurried way that children do when they feel safe, when the streets are familiar, and the faces along them are known. He rode his bicycle more than he walked, not fast, not recklessly, but in a steady rhythm, circling the same streets, passing the same houses, noticing the same details day after day, until they became part of how he understood the place. And Maple Street was one of those places he had ridden down at countless times. In the mornings when the air was still cool, in the afternoons when the sun sat high and warm, and in the evenings when the light softened and the town began to settle. So when something changed even slightly, he noticed. The first time had been the evening before, when he was heading home, his feet moving slowly on the pedals, not in any hurry to get there, letting the last of the daylight stretch the ride just a little longer. He had seen the light at the end of the street still, and though he did not stop, did not question it. Something about it stayed with him, not as a thought exactly, but as a feeling. The kind that sits quietly in the background, waiting to be noticed again. And the next day he noticed it again. It was late afternoon now. The kind of time when the day feels like it is pausing before deciding whether to continue or begin its slow drift toward evening. And Tommy was out on his bicycle once more, riding without a plan, following the familiar turns that had become second nature. As he turned onto Maple Street, his eyes moved ahead, not searching, just looking, and there it was, the house, the porch, the lights still on, even in daylight. He slowed not suddenly, just enough, his feet easing off the pedals, his movement becoming quieter, more thoughtful, because now was not just something he had seen once. It was something that had stayed, and that made it different. He coasted a little closer, the soft hum of his tires against the pavement the only sound marking his movement. And as he approached, he tilted his head slightly, the way children do when they are trying to understand something, without quite putting it into words. The light did not flicker, not dim it, simply remained steady, as if it belonged to no particular time of day. Tommy brought his bicycle to a slow stop, one foot touching the ground, the other still resting lightly on the pedal. His gaze fixed on the porch, he did not feel afraid, not even curious in the usual way, just aware of something that did not quite match the rest of the street. After a moment, he looked toward the windows, still quiet, no movement, no sign of anyone inside. The house felt the same as it always had, and yet not quite. He shifted his weight slightly, the bicycle leaning with him, and for a brief moment he considered riding closer, maybe even stopping at the gate the way Mrs. Dorsey had the night before, but something held him where he was. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, just a quiet sense that there was no need to go any farther. Its seeing was enough. After a while, he pushed himself forward again, the bicycle rolling gently as he continued down the street, passing the house without turning back, though the image of it remained with him, settling into his thoughts in that same quiet way later that evening. As he sat on the steps outside his home, his bicycle resting beside him, he found himself looking toward Maple Street again, though he could not see the house from where he sat. "Mom," he said after a while, his voice soft, not urgent, just thoughtful. "Yes," came the reply from inside. "That light on Maple Street," he said, pausing slightly as if deciding how to explain it. It was on again. There was a moment of quiet then. "Sometimes people forget," his mother said gently, not dismissing, not questioning, just offering a simple answer that fit easily into the shape of things. Tommy nodded, even though she could not see him. Asterisk. "Yeah," he said, and for a moment it seemed like enough, but later, as the evening deepened and the sky turned that soft shade between blue and dark, he looked again, this time from his window, leaning slightly to the side, just enough to catch a glimpse down the street. There it was, still on, still steady, still part of something he did not quite understand. He did not say anything more about it, not that night, but as he lay in bed, the quiet of the house settling around him, the faint sounds of the town drifting through the open window, he found himself thinking about it again, not in a way that kept him awake, not in a way that demanded answers, present like a thought that had found a place to stay and outside in the quiet, unhurried night of Milford Junction, the porch light at the end of Maple Street continued to glow Changadoon Bond quietly waiting. In Milford Junction, the morning has a way of arriving quietly, as if it does not wish to disturb the last traces of sleep still resting in the corners of houses. And on most days, the routines begin before anyone fully notices that they have begun. The kettle warming, the doors opening, the first footsteps on the sidewalk. All of it blending into a rhythm that feels steady and expected. And for Calvin, the mail carrier, that rhythm was something he followed without thinking. His route laid out in the same sequence each day, each stop coming just when it should, each mailbox opening and closing with a familiar motion that required no effort at all. He had only been working in Milford Junction since the spring thaw, not long enough to know every story, but long enough to understand the patterns, the way people waved, the way doors opened just slightly before he reached them, the way certain houses always had something waiting, a note, a parcel, or sometimes just a quiet acknowledgement of his passing. And Maple Street had already become one of those familiar places, a stretch of road where nothing unexpected usually happened, where the houses sat comfortably in their routines, and the mornings unfolded in the same gentle way day after day. But that morning felt slightly different, not in a way that could be pointed out, not in a way that changed anything directly, but in the subtle sense that something had shifted just enough to be noticed, like a clock that is only a minute off, or a sound that arrives just a fraction too late. Calvin turned onto Maple Street at his usual time, the mailbag resting against his side, the soft weight of it something he barely registered anymore. And as he walked, his steps followed the same steady pace, stopping at each house, placing envelopes, adjusting small packages, moving on without pause. The air was cool, carrying that faint scent of damp grass and early sunlight. And somewhere down the block, a screen door closed with a soft thud, followed by the distant hum of a lawnmower starting up earlier than it needed to. Everything was as it should be, and yet as he moved farther down the street, his gaze lifted slightly, not intentionally, just in that natural way the eyes move ahead. And that was when he saw it, the house at the end of the street, the porch, the light still on, even in the clear, steady light of morning. He slowed, not stopping, just enough for the shift to be felt in his steps, his attention settling for a moment on something that did not quite belong to the rest of the scene. No, Calvin was not the kind of person to question things too quickly. He had learned early in the job that most small oddities had simple explanations: a missed delivery, a forgotten switch, a door left open by accident, and usually, by the next day, everything returned to its place without needing to be understood. But this felt different, not urgent, not concerning, just present. He continued walking, reaching the next mailbox, opening it, placing the letters inside, closing it again with the same quiet motion, and then moving forward, though now his awareness remained just slightly ahead of him, resting on that steady glow at the end of the street. When he finally reached the house, he did not pause right away. He followed the same routine, stepping up to the mailbox, reaching inside his bag, sorting through the envelopes with practiced ease, finding the one addressed to Mr. Ellison. He held it for a moment, Not long, just enough to notice the name, the familiar weight of it, then placed it inside the box, closed the lid, and straightened slightly. His eyes moved toward the porch, the light still glowing above it, soft and unchanged, and then to the windows, quiet, still, offering nothing beyond the reflection of the morning light. There was no sound from inside, no movement, nothing to suggest that the house was any different from what it had always been. And yet standing there was a stillness that felt just a little deeper than usual, as if the space around the house had settled into something quieter than the rest of the street. Calvin shifted his weight slightly, his hand resting briefly against the strap of his bag, and for a moment he considered stepping a little closer, maybe up to the porch, maybe just enough to see if there was any sign of movement inside. But then he did not because he chose not to, but because there was no clear reason to. And in Milford Junction, that was often enough. He nodded slightly to himself, a small gesture that carried no particular meaning, and turned to continue his route, his steps returning to their usual rhythm as he moved away from the house. Behind him, the light remained steady, unchanged, as if it existed outside of the day's routine altogether. As Calvin finished the rest of his deliveries, the feeling stayed with him, not as a concern, not as something that needed to be solved, but as a quiet awareness, something that had entered the rhythm of the day without disturbing it. Later, as he sat on the steps behind the post office, taking a short break, the sun now higher, the air warmer, he found himself thinking about the house again, the way the light had remained on, the way the place had felt just slightly different from everything around it. He took a sip of his water, leaned back slightly, and let the thought settle, not pushing it away, not holding on to it, just allowing it to exist in that quiet space where most things in Milford Junction seemed to belong. And by the time he stood up again, brushing the dust lightly from his hands, the day had moved on, the moment had passed, and everything had returned to its usual place, everything except for one small detail. At the end of Maple Street, where the porch light continued to glow soft, steady, and quietly waiting. In a place like Milford Junction, names have a way of lingering, not just in conversation, but in the quiet spaces between moments, written on envelopes, spoken in passing, remembered long after the reason for remembering has faded. And for Calvin, the mail carrier, most names came and went without much thought, part of the routine, something read and delivered, and then gently forgotten as the day moved forward. But every now and then, there was a name that stayed, not loudly, not insistently, just quietly present. And that morning, as he sorted through the stack of letters at the post office, preparing for his route, one name seemed to hold his attention just a little longer than the rest. Ellison, printed neatly on a single envelope, the handwriting careful, almost deliberate, as if the person who wrote it had taken their time, making sure each letter settled exactly where it should. Calvin paused, his thumb resting lightly against the edge of the paper, his eyes tracing the name once more without quite meaning to. It was not unfamiliar. He had delivered to that house before, several times now. Always the same quiet place at the end of Maple Street, always the same stillness around it, as if the house itself preferred not to be noticed too much. And yet there was something about this letter, Something in the way it felt, not heavier, not unusual in any obvious way, just different. He slid it into his bag with the others, adjusting the stack so it sat evenly, and then continued his sorting, though the name lingered in his mind like a tune that had not quite finished playing. Outside, the morning had begun its slow unfolding, the streets filling gently with movement, doors opening, voices carrying lightly across fences, the soft rhythm of another day taking shape. By the time Calvin stepped onto Maple Street, the sun had climbed just enough to warm the edges of things, the shadows shorter now, the air holding that steady calm that comes after the first hours of morning have passed. He moved along his route as usual, each stop blending into the next, the quiet repetition of his work, something he had come to appreciate, until, once again, he reached the end of the street. The house, the porch, the light, still on, even now. In the fullness of day, Calvin slowed slightly, the same subtle shift in his pace as before, his attention drawn forward, not urgently, but with a quiet kind of curiosity that did not quite ask questions. He reached into his bag, his hand finding the envelope without searching. As if it had been waiting there for him all along, Ellison, the name felt more present now. He stepped up to the mailbox, opened it, and for a moment, he did not place the letter inside. Instead, he held it just briefly, his eyes lifting toward the house, toward the windows, toward the stillness that seemed to rest just beyond the surface of things. There was no movement, no sound, only that same quiet presence. And the porch light, soft, unchanging. Calvin let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. A small release that carried no real weight, and then gently placed the letter into the mailbox. Closing the lid with care, he remained there for a second longer than usual. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough for the moment to settle. And then, without quite deciding to, he stepped back, his gaze returning once more to the house. There was something about it. Not something wrong, not something broken, just something unfinished, as if the house itself was waiting for something that had not yet arrived, or perhaps something that had already passed. Calvin adjusted the strap of his bag and turned away, continuing his route, though the feeling followed him, quiet and steady, like a shadow that did not quite match the shape of what cast it. Later that afternoon, as the town settled into its slower rhythm, the sun beginning its gradual descent, the air softening again, Calvin found himself passing Maple Street once more on his way back. It was not part of his route anymore, not at that hour, and yet his steps carried him there anyway. Not directly, not intentionally, just in that slow, natural way that paths sometimes shift without being told to. The street was quieter now, the earlier movement replaced by the gentle hush of late afternoon, the kind that settles over things like a blanket, soft and undisturbed. And at the end of the street, the house remained, the porch, the light, still on. Even now, Calvin stopped this time, not close, just far enough to take in the whole of it, the shape of the house, the quiet way it sat among the others, the sense that it existed just slightly apart from the rest of the street. He studied it for a moment, his eyes moving slowly, taking in details he had not noticed before, the worn edges of the steps, The way the curtains hung just slightly uneven, the faint outline of something resting on the porch chair. And then, as he stood there, something else came to him. A thought not clear, not fully formed, but present enough to be noticed. He had never seen anyone there. Not once. Not in all the mornings he had passed. Not in the afternoons. Not even in the small glimpses of time when the town felt most alive. The house had always been there. The mail had always been delivered. The name had always appeared. And yet there had been no sign of the person who lived inside. Calvin shifted slightly, his gaze lingering for one last moment, and then quietly. He turned and walked back the way he had come, leaving the house behind, leaving the light, leaving the name, but not entirely, because some things in Milford Junction have a way of staying with you. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to be remembered when the rest of the day has moved on. And that evening, as the sky deepened into soft shades of blue, and the town settled into its familiar calm, there was one small detail that remained unchanged. At the end of Maple Street, the porch light still glowed, soft, steady, and quietly waiting. There are certain windows in Milford Junction that seem to do more than simply let in the light. They hold it, shape it, and sometimes, if you look long enough, they appear to hold memories as well. Not in any way that can be proven, not in anything you could point to and say with certainty, just in the way the glass catches reflections that feel slightly older than the moment itself. And the window at the end of Maple Street, the one facing the quiet road, had that kind of feeling. It was not remarkable at first glance, just a simple pane framed by aging wood, the paint worn gently at the edges, the glass clear but softened by time. But if you happened to pause there, as some folks occasionally did, you might notice how the light lingered just a little longer against it, how it seemed to remember that afternoon as the sun dipped lower and stretched the shadows across the street. Mrs. Dorsey found herself walking slower than usual, her knitting bag resting lightly against her arm, her steps unhurried in the way they often were when there was no particular place she needed to be. She had not meant to stop, not really, but something about the way the light fell across that window caught her attention. A soft golden reflection, warm and steady, like the kind of glow you might see in a room where someone had just been sitting moments before. She paused at the edge of the sidewalk, her gaze settling on the glass, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to bring something into focus that was not quite there. For a moment, she thought she saw movement. Not outside, but inside, a shift in the light. A faint suggestion of presence, like the outline of someone passing just beyond view. She held her breath without meaning to, the world around her continuing as it always did. A distant car, a breeze through the trees, the soft hum of the town carrying on. And then it was gone. The window returned to stillness. The reflection unchanged, the moment slipping away as quietly as it had come. Mrs. Dorsey adjusted her grip on the knitting bag, letting out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing as she gave a gentle shake of her head. Just the light, she murmured softly to herself. The kind of explanation people offer when something does not quite fit, but not enough to trouble them. Still, she did not move right away. Her eyes lingered on the window for a few seconds longer, as if waiting for something else, something that did not come. Eventually, she continued on her way, her steps slow and steady, but her thoughts just slightly altered. Like a thread pulled gently from the edge of a fabric. Later that evening, as the town settled into that quiet hour between sunset and night, the kind of hour when everything softens and even the sounds seem to lower themselves, Calvin found himself thinking about the same house again. Not deliberately, not in a way that demanded attention, just in the background, like a memory that had not fully formed yet. He sat on the steps outside his small apartment, a cup of tea resting in his hands, the warmth steady against his palms, his gaze drifting across the quiet street in front of him. There was nothing unusual about the evening, the sky fading gently, the air calm, the distant sound of someone closing a door, and yet his mind returned to the name, Ellison, and the letter and the house, and the light that never seemed to turn off. He took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes lowering for a moment, and then, without quite deciding to, he stood. The motion felt natural, unforced, as if it had already been decided somewhere before the thought reached him. He set the cup down and began to walk, his steps carrying him through the quiet streets of Milford Junction, past familiar houses, past soft-lit windows, past the gentle signs of evening life settling in, until, once again, he reached Maple Street. The road stretched out before him, quiet, still, the houses resting in that calm way they do at the end of the day. And at the far end, the house, the porch, the light still on. Calvin slowed as he approached, his footsteps soft against the pavement, his attention drawn forward in that same quiet way as before. This time, though, something felt different. Not louder, not clearer, just closer. He stopped a few steps away from the gate, his gaze lifting toward the window. The same window, the one that caught the light, the one that seemed to hold something just beneath the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The glass reflected only the fading sky, the soft outline of trees, the quiet shape of the street behind him, and then there it was again. A shift, subtle, almost too slight to notice, like the memory of movement rather than movement itself. Calvin's breath slowed, his eyes fixed on the window, his body still. It was not a person, not clearly, not anything he could describe, just a suggestion, a presence that felt less like something new and more like something that had always been there, watching or perhaps simply remembering. The moment stretched, quiet and delicate, like a thread that could break if pulled too tight. And then, as gently as it had come, it faded. The window returned to stillness, the reflection unchanged, the house quiet. Calvin blinked once, his shoulders easing slightly. Though he had not realized they had tensed, he exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a soft, controlled breath. There was no fear, not really, just a sense of something unresolved, something waiting. He stood there a moment longer, his gaze lingering, and then, without any sudden movement, he turned and stepped back. Not hurried, not unsettled, just thoughtful. As he walked away, the evening wrapped around him once more, the familiar sounds returning, the soft rhythm of Milford Junction continuing as it always did. But behind him, at the end of Maple Street, the window remained, catching the last of the fading light, holding it, keeping it, as if it remembered something the rest of the town had long since forgotten. And somewhere within that quiet house, whether in the walls or the light, or the stillness itself, something remained. Not lost, not gone, just waiting to be noticed again. In small towns like Milford Junction, records have a way of staying longer than they should, not out of neglect, but out of habit. The quiet understanding that not everything needs to be cleared away just because time has moved forward. Some things remain because they belong to the rhythm of the place. And the post office was one of those places where the past sat quietly among the present, tucked into drawers, written in ledgers, stacked in boxes that had not been opened in years. It was on a late morning, when the air had warmed just enough to carry the scent of paper and dust, that Calvin found himself standing behind the counter, not because he needed to be there, but because he had arrived a little earlier than usual, and the quiet inside felt like something worth keeping for a while. The shelves behind him held rows of old files, names and addresses stretching back further than anyone working there now could remember, each one a small piece of the town's story. Calvin ran his hand lightly along the edge of one of the drawers, his fingers brushing against the worn label. Something about the house at the end of Maple Street had stayed with him, not as a question exactly, but as a presence. And without quite deciding to, he pulled the drawer open. The sound was soft, a low wooden slide, like something being uncovered slowly rather than revealed. Inside, the record sat neatly arranged. Envelopes, forwarding slips, change of address forms, each one marking a small shift in someone's life. He flipped through them carefully, his movements unhurried, his attention steady. Names passed by without meaning, familiar and unfamiliar alike, until, almost without effort, his hand stopped Ellison. The same careful handwriting, the same deliberate shape of the letters. Calvin lifted the file gently, setting it on the counter, his eyes scanning the details. There were several entries, older than he expected, years older change of address notices, temporary holds, delivery confirmations, all written in the same steady hand, all tied to the same house. And then near the bottom, something different. A note, short, simple, and untouched. No forwarding address requested. Calvin's brow softened slightly as he read it again, the words settling into place with a quiet weight. No forwarding address, which meant the mail had continued, which meant the name had remained, which meant... He did not finish the thought. Instead, he turned the page, finding one last entry, a date, and beside it, a small mark. The kind used when a record is meant to be closed. But this one had not been filed away. It had not been removed. It had simply stayed. Calvin stood there for a moment, the quiet of the post office pressing gently around him, the soft hum of the building, the distant sound of someone moving outside. There was no urgency in what he was seeing, no sudden realization, just a slow unfolding, like a story being told without needing to be finished. He closed the file carefully, returning it to its place, his hand lingering for a brief second before sliding the drawer shut. The sound settled into the room, soft and final. Later that day, as the afternoon stretched into its slower hours, Calvin adjusted his route slightly, not enough to be noticed, just enough to pass Maple Street again The sun was lower now, the light warmer, the shadows longer, the town easing into that quiet space between activity and rest. And at the end of the street, the house remained the porch, the light still on. But this time, as Calvin approached, something felt different. Not in the house, not in the air, but in what he carried with him. The knowledge, not fully formed, but present enough to shift the way he saw things. He stepped closer than he had before, his feet moving across the edge of the yard. The grass soft beneath his shoes. The mailbox stood where it always had. Steady, unchanged, he opened it slowly, not expecting anything. And yet, inside, there was a letter. One he had not delivered, one he had not seen before. The envelope was slightly worn, the edges softened as if it had been handled more than once. And on the front, the same name, Ellison. But the handwriting was different this time. Less steady, more personal, as if it had been written not for delivery, but for meaning. Calvin hesitated, his fingers resting lightly against the paper. There was no return stamp, no official marking, just the name and the house, and the quiet weight of something that did not quite belong to the usual flow of things. He glanced toward the porch, toward the window, toward the stillness that seemed to hold its place no matter the time of day. And then, gently, he took the letter from the mailbox, holding it in both hands, not opening it, not yet, just holding it, as if the act itself mattered more than what came next. The breeze moved softly through the trees, the light shifting slightly as the sun dipped lower. And for a moment, everything felt balanced on something unseen. A pause, a quiet space between what had been left behind and what was about to be understood. Calvin stood there, the letter resting in his hands, the house before him, the town behind him, and somewhere in that stillness, the story of Ellison, which had lingered quietly for so long, was beginning at last to be heard. There are some letters that arrive exactly when they are supposed to, carried along by schedules and routes and the steady rhythm of days. And then there are others, the kind that take their time, the kind that seem to wait, not because they were delayed, but because they were never meant to be read too soon. Calvin stood at the edge of the yard, the letter resting lightly in his hands, his fingers tracing the softened edges of the envelope. The air had gone quieter now, not in the way of silence, but in the way of something settling, as if the moment itself had found a place to rest. He looked once more toward the house, the porch, the window, the light still on, and then, gently, he turned the envelope over, his thumb slipping beneath the fold, opening it with care. The paper inside was thin, slightly creased, as if it had been unfolded and folded again more than once. He drew it out slowly, his movements unhurried, respectful in a way he could not quite explain. The handwriting matched the name, careful, personal, steady in some places, softer in others. And as his eyes began to move across the page, the words did not rush. They settled one by one, like quiet footsteps. If you are reading this, then I suppose the house has not been forgotten entirely. That is a comfort I did not expect to need. I stayed here longer than most people thought I would, longer than I told anyone, and in the end, I suppose I became part of the place more than I ever meant to. There was a time when this house was full, Not with noise exactly, but with presence. With the kind of quiet that comes from knowing someone else is just in the next room. Even if you do not speak, her name was Margaret. She had a way of leaving the porch light on. Even during the day, she said it made the house feel less empty. Though it never felt empty to me, not while she was there. After she was gone, I kept the light on, at first without thinking. And then because turning it off felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. The mail kept coming, as it always does, and I found that I liked the sound of it. The small certainty of it, letters arriving, names being spoken. Even if only on paper, I did not answer most of them. Not because I could not, but because I no longer knew what to say. Time moves differently when you are the only one keeping track of it. Days stretch, and then they fold into each other. And before you realize it, the years have settled quietly around you. I suppose what I am trying to say is this: if the light is still on, it was never meant to guide anyone back. It was meant to remind me that something had once been here. And that perhaps, in some small way, it still is. If you have come this far, thank you for noticing. That is more than I expected, Ellison. Calvin's eyes rested on the final line. The words settling into him slowly, not as something surprising, but as something that had been waiting to be understood. The letter did not feel like a message meant for him alone. It felt like something left behind, something offered, to anyone who happened to pause long enough to notice. The breeze moved gently through the yard, the leaves shifting softly, the light from the porch steady and unchanged. Calvin lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting once more toward the house. And this time, the stillness felt different. Not empty, not waiting, just complete. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope. His hands steady, his movements quiet. There was no urgency now, no question. Only a kind of understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. He stepped forward, closing the mailbox gently, returning the letter to where it had been, not as something forgotten, but as something that had found its place again. For a moment, he stood there, the soft hum of the town behind him, the quiet presence of the house before him. And then, slowly, he turned, walking back down Maple Street, his steps light, unhurried, as if the day had settled into something just a little softer than before. Behind him, the porch light remained, not as a signal, not as a call, but as a memory, steady, warm, and quietly enough that only those who took the time to notice would ever understand why it was still there. There is a certain kind of quiet that only comes at the very end of a day, not the kind that follows noise, but the kind that settles gently, as if the world itself has decided it has done enough for now. And at Milford Junction, that quiet has a way of spreading slowly, drifting from one street to another, from one porch to the next, until the whole town feels wrapped in it that evening. As the last of the light slipped behind the trees and the sky softened into deeper shades of blue, Maple Street grew still in that familiar, comforting way. The houses rested, the windows dimmed. The small sounds of the day folded away one by one, and at the very end of the street, the house remained unchanged, unhurried. The porch light still glowing softly, not bright enough to call attention, not dim enough to disappear, just steady, just present. Calvin had returned to his apartment. His steps slower than usual, his thoughts quieter, as if something inside him had shifted into a place of rest. He sat once more on the steps, the same cup beside him, now cool. His hands resting loosely in his lap, the evening air carried that gentle stillness, the kind that does not ask anything of you. And for a while, he simply sat there, not thinking, not searching, just letting the moment be what it was, across town. Mrs. Darcy had finished her knitting for the night, the yarn folded neatly beside her chair, the lamp casting a soft pool of light over the quiet room. She paused before turning it off, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the street beyond, toward nothing in particular. And for a brief moment, she thought again of that house. The window, the light, the feeling that something had been there, and perhaps still was. She smiled softly to herself, not because she understood it, but because she did not need to. And then she reached over and turned off the lamp, letting the room settle into darkness. The town followed in its own quiet way, doors closed, asterisk, curtains drawn, voices softened, until the only sounds left were the small, steady ones, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the night, the quiet breathing of a place at rest. And at the end of Maple Street, the porch light remained, not out of habit anymore, not out of memory alone, but because it had become part of the town itself, a small, steady presence, a reminder that something once lived there, that something had been loved there, and that even when time moves on, some things choose to stay, not loudly, not for attention, but simply because they belong. The night deepens slowly, the sky stretching wide and calm above the rooftops, the stars beginning to show, one by one, soft and distant, and Milford Junction drifted further into sleep, the kind of sleep that comes easily, without effort, without thought, where the day lets go of you just as gently as you let go of it. And if, somewhere in that quiet, you found yourself thinking about a light left on, or a letter that arrived a little later than expected, or a name that stayed just a little longer than the rest, you might notice that those thoughts did not weigh on you. They did not pull at you. They simply settled softly, like everything else in this small, steady town. And as the hours moved on, uncounted and unhurried, the porch light at the end of Maple Street continued to glow, warm, quiet, and just bright enough to remind anyone who needed it that not everything fades away. Some things remain gently, kindly, exactly as they are. And with that, the night carries you a little further. The quiet deepens, the world softens, and sleep comes, slow and steady, like a light that never needed to be turned off. And now, there is nothing left to follow, nothing left to figure out, only the quiet, only the stillness, and somewhere far away, a soft light continues to glow, steady, warm, unchanging, and you can rest now, because everything that needed to be said already has been. So let the night take you gently, and sleep, slowly, peacefully, and without effort. Good night, dear friends.